Jeffrey Sachs es el economista más famoso del mundo. Escribe libros con Bono, da conferencias con Angelina Jolie, se saca fotos con él desde George Clooney hasta DiCaprio y es uno de los preferidos del Papa Francisco. En mayo le dijo a Alberto Fernández que no se hiciera problemas por un default de algunos meses, porque igual habría varios países pidiendo renegociar su deuda externa. Y hoy le sigue recomendando lo mismo. Dice textualmente: hay que tener paciencia para negociar bien y no dejarse ganar por la ansiedad. Jeffrey Sachs dirigió uno de los institutos de la Universidad de Columbia, donde Joseph Stiglitz es profesor, y hasta antes de asumir como ministro de Economía del nuevo gobierno, en diciembre pasado, también su discípulo Martín Guzmán, para quien Jeffrey Sachs solo tiene palabras de elogio. Le parece una buena idea el impuesto a las 12.000 personas más ricas. Dice que Macri no fue una excepción en la lista de fracasos de Argentina, que el problema de Argentina trasciende a quien gobierna, porque desde hace décadas es el estado de crisis continuo quien realmente gobierna. Dice que Argentina es un país en el que todo estudiante de economía que quiera aprender esa materia tiene que venir a estudiar, porque es el ejemplo de la mayor cantidad de fracasos económicos. Tiene esperanzas de que esta vez Argentina corte el ciclo de crisis perpetua, aunque es muy pesimista con las consecuencias del coronavirus en la economía mundial.
En la Argentina se dijo hace 2 meses atrás de que vos le dijiste a Alberto Fernández que no sea problema si había default de algunos meses, porque total iba a haber entre 30 y 40 países que iban a estar renegociando su deuda y eso no va a traer ningún problema de imagen mundial. 2 meses después de aquella recomendación, ¿hoy le harías la misma?
I think that Argentina is doing the right thing, which is to make clear that the debts need to be restructured. It's doing it seriously based on rigorous data. Its position is supported by the International Monetary Fund technical staff, which is quite important and useful. It's rather straightforward to calculate that debts that carry the high interest rates that Argentine debts carry right now are not compatible with basic stability and well-being of the people of Argentina, and therefore need to be restructured. Some countries are able to refinance their debts by borrowing at very, very low interest rates today and repaying their old debts. Companies are refinancing their debts. Governments are refinancing their debts. It makes perfect sense for Argentina, which has coupon rates of 7% on many of the bonds, to restructure these debts to interest rates of 2 or 3%, which is what the world market rate is right now, even lower for some countries. So I think that the government is doing the right thing. We're in a very deep global crisis. Argentina is in a very significant crisis, like all parts of the world, in terms of COVID and the economic impacts of the epidemic. And so I don't really see a more reasonable way forward than what the government is doing.
Argentina hizo una oferta de reestructuración de su deuda externa, pero no fue aprobada por sus acreedores. ¿Crees que puede estar siendo usada Argentina como un laboratorio por los acreedores frente a seguras futuras reestructuraciones de deudas soberanas tras el coronavirus?
Certainly, creditors are aware that they don't want to make precedents for other countries or invitations to other countries to reschedule. So I would not have chosen Argentina's timing if there were a choice. It wasn't a choice for the government, it was a reality, unfortunately. But the fact of the matter is creditors are aware that when they make a deal with Argentina, that becomes a foundation for deals that other countries are going to require. And so in this way, they hold out, they appeal for themselves to be bailed out by the IMF or by others. And there's a time delay in this, but I don't find that either surprising or really very worrying or anything that one can do about this. The key, in my opinion, is for Argentina to behave in good faith, to be clear, transparent, to be in close cooperation with the IMF, which it is right now, in estimating fiscal space, in identifying the range of restructuring that's needed. What more can a debtor country with a government that inherited an overhang of unsustainable debt in the middle of this unprecedented epidemic do? The fact that creditors are in some cases recalcitrant, others have agreed already, but in some cases recalcitrant, this is par for the course. Things don't come immediately. It's not ideal. I'd rather see an agreement reached early on. I think it would be mutually beneficial. And maybe if it were just Argentina and the creditors by themselves, you'd get a faster agreement. But because of the consideration that you mentioned, that they're looking over their shoulder at dozens of other countries, they don't want to reach an agreement so fast.
Los tenedores de bonos sostienen que sería mejor una quita moderada de la Argentina para que pueda volver al mercado de deuda voluntario. Pero el ministro de Economía de Argentina, Martín Guzmán, sostiene que no es así porque igual Argentina no tendrá posibilidad de volver a tomar deuda en el mercado voluntario. ¿Qué opinas sobre eso?
I don't think Argentina should go back to the capital markets anytime soon. This has mainly been a short-term temptation and a longer-term curse for Argentina for decades. I've been involved with Argentina one way or another for the last 40 years, watching from outside as an economist who studies and analyzes these issues, how Argentina would come back to the capital markets, fall into another crisis, have to reschedule, return, be declared as over the crisis, only to have a new crisis hit in short order. And that was the fate of the Macri administration, after all. It proclaimed a solution. We're back in the markets. But this is not really the right way to approach this. The right way to approach this is really clean up the balance sheets. Don't get into another crisis. And I hope that Argentina can manage that.
Antes de unirse al nuevo gobierno de Alberto Fernández como ministro de Economía, hasta diciembre pasado, Martín Guzmán trabajó en la Universidad de Columbia y desarrolló estrechos vínculos con vos, que también estás en Columbia. ¿Cuál es tu opinión de Guzmán?
He's a wonderful person, very sincere, very fine economist, and operating with great professionalism. I really like that and appreciate that. I think that it's exactly what Argentina should have right now. You know, there's enough instability all around that I don't think it would be very desirable to have a politician-type finance minister making unbacked statements or outlandish or flamboyant statements or making unreasonable promises. Mr. Guzman is very measured, very low-key, very sincere and serious in analysis. And I really hope that this is enough, because the world doesn't need more Trumps and Bolsonaros and kind of craziness, which is all around. We need some sober-headed, realistic ideas about how to move forward. And I think the professionalism of Minister Guzman is exactly what's called for.
Jeffrey, ¿qué recomendación le harías al ministro de Economía argentino en su renegociación con la deuda privada internacional?
I would say be calm, be patient. Most of all, attend to Argentina's own internal needs right now, which is to fight the pandemic. Argentina, unfortunately, is in a region where there's almost no success in fighting the pandemic. of course, I think Bolsonaro is completely unhinged and irrational, a danger for Brazil and a danger for all of South America. Even Chile is having a very hard time containing this epidemic. Peru and Ecuador have been hard hit. Unfortunately, Mexico is very poorly led right now with AMLO also, like Bolsonaro, trying to minimize the impact of COVID-19. I can tell you none of that makes sense. This is a very serious disease. It's a very serious epidemic. It is very disruptive globally. The international crisis will be prolonged in no small part because the United States, too, is in chaos under the foolishness, recklessness of Donald Trump. And so Argentina needs to really be careful right now, contain this epidemic, focus the scarce resources on fighting the disease, on protecting the supply chains, on keeping the exports, especially the agricultural exports, going. The world needs Argentina's products, and Argentina needs the foreign exchange income. And I hope and expect that the creditors will come around to a reasonable agreement. But if it doesn't happen this week or this month or next month, I don't think it's any kind of tragedy, frankly. There's enough things to worry about other than what BlackRock or Fidelity are doing right now. This is just not the high priority.
El hecho de que algunos acreedores concentren una parte significativa de la deuda, especialmente BlackRock, vos mencionaste también Fidelity, ¿es a favor, dificulta o genera problemas en la renegociación de la deuda?
It's very favorable and very important because they can actually make a deal. And when they make a deal, they'll carry a lot of the rest of the bondholders along with them. Mm-hmm. And they should be responsible. A company like BlackRock is not really just a private company. It's almost a state company in the United States. It is aligned with the U.S. Treasury. It's aligned with the Fed. It manages $7 trillion of assets. It's part of the U.S. system. It ought to be thinking systemically. That means responsibly. This is not a game for BlackRock to get some extra percentage point. That's absurd. Argentina's fate is far more important as a sovereign nation with stability that is not part of breaking up the international finances. So I'm glad that BlackRock is a creditor and a systemic player in the sense that it has a big stake and a big responsibility in holding the international system together. And I know Larry Fink knows full well that he ought to make a deal with Argentina and just get on with it, because it is not of any consequence for BlackRock whether the interest rate is 2% or 3% or 5%. It means nothing for BlackRock, but it means a lot for Argentina.
Jeffrey, ¿qué recomendación le harías a la Argentina y al gobierno en general en su relación con el Fondo Monetario Internacional?
I think the relationship with the IMF right now is very healthy in that there is a strong interchange at the technical level between the IMF technicians and the Argentine technicians. And since the Ministry of Economy is led by a technician, that really helps. And there is the intention by the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, to find a real solution for Argentina. I know that. I've heard her speak on this several times. I've, of course, discussed the issues with her, and she wants a reasonable solution. I think reason is really the key here. This isn't emotional I deserve this, or I deserve that, or this is fair, or that's not unfair. It's really about finding a solution based on the data of what can be done that meets the needs of Argentina and its people and is suitable as a solution for the IMF and the international financial system. And given that interest rates today are between 1% and 2% for the long term for the US or Europe and for many of the bonds in BlackRock's portfolio, lowering the interest rates to a point where Argentina really can pay makes the reasonable sense. And I know that the managing director and the staff of the IMF believe that. I hope that Argentina actually would enter some kind of program with the IMF, not the one that was put together in a desperate emergency under Macri. That didn't work. It was thrown together very quickly. It was kind of an act of desperation as things were falling to pieces. This one is after all of these dramatic events, both COVID and the lack of an agreement to date with some of the important creditors. And I think it's possible, therefore, to find a very helpful and reasonable agreement between the fund and Argentina that holds at bay whether there's an agreement with the private creditors for the moment. That should not block good arrangements with the IMF. And the IMF knows full well this is not the time for austerity. I mean, that's absurd because austerity is being compelled by the pandemic, but you don't add to the austerity. Indeed, the US budget deficit this year is going to be more than $1.7 trillion. So who can preach austerity in this absurd situation? We're really actually much higher, most likely, over a 2-year period, much higher than 10%, possibly nearing 20% of GDP. So this is the time, obviously, to fight a pandemic and to try to smooth things over until this pandemic is brought under global control.
¿La influencia de Estados Unidos en el Fondo Monetario Internacional es decisiva?
It's very influential in general, but the U.S. Is in a really weird situation right now. Of course, we're a few months before an election. Our president is not a very stable person. Policy making is completely unstable in the United States. I don't really know whether they're paying any attention to Argentina at all, frankly, because the real focus is on double-digit unemployment in the United States, mega budget deficits that are trillions of dollars, and constant political feuding because Trump enters this final lap of the election season with an approval rating of about 40% and a disapproval rating of 55%, and with his opponent far ahead in the polls right now. So I don't think that they have too much time for thinking about Argentina or about the IMF for that matter. And it's not a very internationalist administration to begin with, as you know. It's an America first kind of craziness that the whole world is trying to adjust to, but maybe won't have to adjust to it after November.
¿Cómo evaluás la conducción en general de Kristalina Georgieva al frente del Fondo Monetario Internacional?
In general, the management is very good in that the managing director is a very experienced global policy manager. She has been at the forefront of humanitarian crises. She's been at the forefront of European politics. She has been running the World Bank in recent years in operational terms, and now she is very well placed in this worst global crisis in 75 years since World War II to help steer the IMF. So I'm very impressed, and I know that she's very sincere in using all multilateral tools to address this crisis. From the IMF's point of view, remember, there are 80 countries or so that have come for emergency financing already. This is a global emergency that we're facing. Argentina is just one country on a long list of deep challenges right now. And so it's not the center of world attention as it might be felt in Buenos Aires. It's why I think stay calm, focus on your internal problems is the right thing to do. And managing this global scene is very difficult, especially because Trump is, is so unstable that every international institution is watching its back. Who could imagine that the US president would cancel funding for the World Health Organization at the time of the greatest pandemic in its history? It's mind-boggling. And so there's no international institution that isn't trying to figure out what is going on in the United States. But it's not a very orderly scene. I'm very happy in that context, if one can say happy, that we have such an experienced manager at the helm of the IMF.
El último presidente de Argentina, Mauricio Macri, fue bienvenido por la comunidad global como el asesino del populismo, mientras que los inversores internacionales permitieron que Argentina pidiera prestado sin problemas. Luego vino el Fondo Monetario, rescató al país y presentó proyecciones económicas completamente inexactas y vio como el país se hundía nuevamente más en la estanflación. Cuando yo te hice el último reportaje, era febrero de 2018, todavía no había comenzado la crisis y se suponía que Macri, que estaba en su mejor momento, iba a ser reelecto. ¿Qué responsabilidad tienen los acreedores y el Fondo Monetario Internacional en el colapso de la economía argentina?
Argentina is by nature a very unstable economy because Argentina is a country of macroeconomists. Everyone has lived through multiple crises. Everyone understands foreign exchange markets, stop-go, stop economics. Everyone understands international financial markets. And so what would be almost overlooked in any other place in Argentina is the makings of a crisis. I don't think Mr. Macri's policy making was horrendous in any way, actually. I think it was fine, by and large, but it wasn't what happened when it wasn't moving fast enough in fiscal consolidation or there were tremors. There was a kind of panic, which is familiar in Argentina. Mr. Macri said the word IMF, and that by itself triggered half the collapse because Argentine people know if you say the word IMF, oh my God, there's a crisis ahead. And so there's a lot that is self-fulfilling in Argentina. It's caught in a trap. It's caught in a Groundhog's Day trap, if I could refer to the movie. It replays the same crisis over and over and over again. And partly because everybody expects a crisis. This is a country that has experienced more crises than any other on the planet, with the possible rivalry of your close neighbor, Brazil. But other than that, Argentina really stands on its own. And so when there are minor infractions of policy, and I think Macri certainly made minor infractions of policy, they become major crises in a way that would not be true almost any other place on the planet. Macri did not create great economic sins. Nobody did. But for a country that's ready to move its money from pesos to dollars at a moment's notice, that hears the word of a possible IMF agreement as an invitation to flee the banks, as a worry after so many generations of closing banks or conversions of currency or other things. This is really the problem. And to my mind, that's why I hope that Argentina can really stay calm and stay patient and go for a real agreement, not a short-term fix that 2 years later reverts to yet another crisis. I would like to see this current government live out its term without a new round of financial crisis. It's got enough on its hands between the inherited crisis and the COVID epidemic to just try to find a path to some stability and recovery. And to get there will require patience, forbearance, some social unity, which is very hard in the Argentine context because not only is it crisis prone, it is so politicized that each turn of politics becomes an occasion for another self-fulfilling crisis. In this sense, I really wouldn't blame anyone because the underlying fundamentals in Argentina, even during the Macri crisis and the failed IMF program and so forth, you could have found in many parts of the world that looked stable. The difference is that in Argentina, those flaws turn into mega crises where in other parts of the world, they're hardly noticed. And that is really, to my understanding, Argentina's fate. When you've lived through so many crises, you're always on the edge expecting the next one to occur. And because of the nature of financial panic, they become self-fulfilling. That's why calm and some social unity, some patience, some serious work together with the IMF, not emergency, urgent, desperate programs, is really what I hope for.
Sin embargo, una de las mayores críticas al gobierno de Macri fue la acumulación de tanta deuda. En un periodo de solo 3 años logró acumular casi tanta deuda como toda la que tenía al asumir. La aumentó el 76%. ¿Fue un acto de irresponsabilidad?
I don't think that the gradualism that he adopted, funded by international markets, was all that prudent. I don't think it was all that unusual, by the way. It wasn't extreme. But under Argentina's history, I think certainly in retrospect, there's no doubt to say that the fiscal consolidation should have gone farther and faster. When the IMF emergency program was put together, incidentally, I had no confidence that it would actually work. And that isn't an ex post judgment. That was looking at it at the time. It just seemed to me a kind of desperate move. I think there were politics involved also with the U.S. hoping to keep Mr. Macri in power. And so it was throwing a program together that, to my mind, didn't have much credibility, careful design. It was sudden. It was under urgency. It was in the face of a panic, knowing that an election was coming up. I didn't think it was going to work, and I said so, and it didn't work. And so there's enough that one can say, yes, the borrowing should have been less. This urge to return to the capital markets is always exaggerated, in my opinion. The focus on the capital markets rather than on deeper issues of productivity, science, technology, is a chronic issue. Argentina's future, in any event, doesn't depend on the capital markets. It depends on becoming more productive, more technology-based, deeper changes that are needed in the economy. Those should in any event be the focus of a government. So there's, of course, too much life in the short-term finances, always in Argentina, because that's the nature of a country that lives endlessly in monetary and financial crisis. But that's not how real economies develop or achieve breakthroughs. They achieve breakthroughs through underlying longer-term investments in science and technology. And that's where more emphasis should be paid. But again, saying all of that, and plenty of faults could be found, it is a sad fact that if Argentina does a minor sin, it ends up with a major catastrophe, whereas other countries can sin quite a lot and end up still relatively stable because they're trading off of their longer-term, calmer background and history.
Jeffrey, vos fuiste director entre el año 2002 y el año 2016 del Instituto de la Universidad de Columbia sobre la Tierra y el futuro, donde Joseph Stiglitz es profesor y compartiste con él muchos años, escribiste libros con él. Contanos cómo es tu relación personal con Stiglitz y cuál es tu visión general sobre sus ideas económicas.
Well, we've been colleagues since 2002 and friends for a lot longer than that. Mm-hmm. And so in general, we see eye to eye on most issues, I would say. We're both concerned that economics should be based not only on simple measures like gross domestic product per capita, but on the real conditions of people in their fuller lives, including the distribution of income, the quality of social relations, the honesty of government, and the environmental sustainability of the planet. And so we, in general, see eye to eye on most of these issues.
Hace un mes atrás vos escribiste, te voy a leer textualmente. Cuando un solo coche patina en una autopista helada, el resultado puede ser un choque de 50 autos. Lo mismo ocurre con los mercados financieros internacionales. El incumplimiento de México en 1982 llevó a un amontonamiento de docenas de países con problemas. La devaluación de Tailandia en julio de 1997 desencadenó la crisis financiera asiática. La quiebra de Lehman Brothers en septiembre de 2008 desencadenó la gran recesión en todo el mundo del siglo XXI. Los mercados financieros mundiales tienden a entrar en pánico cuando incluso un solo país, y no siquiera varios, comienza a patinar. Hay probablemente entre 30 y 40 países en profunda dificultad fiscal ahora. Todos ellos necesitan refinanciar sus deudas este año y el próximo hasta la recuperación de la pandemia y que esa recuperación reviva la actividad económica mundial, restaure el ingreso de los gobiernos y reduzca la necesidad de los embolsos de emergencia. En ese contexto, ¿por qué crees que demora tanto el acuerdo de la renegociación de deuda de la Argentina?
Well, first of all, I expected by now that there would be more immediate crises than there have been. And I think the main reason that that hasn't been the case up until now is the massive credit expansion by the Fed and the European Central Bank and other major central banks. So far, what I was envisioning has not come to pass. There are countries in trouble, but even emerging market governments have continued to some extent to borrow on international markets. I did not really believe that easy credit by the Fed by itself would be enough to sustain these emerging market sovereign bond sales. I don't know whether they will in the future. I'm in general still of the more pessimistic view, unfortunately, that with the ongoing epidemic and the ongoing dislocations to the world economy, we are building up bigger and bigger financial crises in more and more countries. So there is an optimistic view that says I'm wrong because easy credit, big budget deficits, and a V-shaped recovery from COVID will enable the world to bounce back. Or another optimistic view is that a vaccine will soon come along and end this epidemic. The other view, which I have, is that because of poor management in so many countries, including my own, including Brazil, including many countries in Asia, this pandemic, and because of the nature of the virus itself, this pandemic is continuing to spread. We are reaching more and more global cases per day. There is no sense that we have turned the corner. In the United States, sadly and dangerously, the cases are accelerating once again. In this context, I'm afraid that the world economy is not having any kind of V-shaped recovery. I'm not sure whether it's having a recovery other than short-term blips. I think we're in a prolonged period of difficulty. If that's true, and that's what I believed from the start, then the fiscal crisis faced by almost every country in the world, including Argentina, but all over the world, will be very severe because public services are needed, schools are needed, frontline workers are needed, healthcare is needed. And with reduced economic activity and impeded international travel, business, and investment, that means big budget deficits. And my view still is that we're more likely than not to see a financial crash of the kind that you quoted me on. That is many, many countries finding a very, very great fiscal crisis ahead. I hope I'm wrong. I hope it's a V-shaped recovery and this just goes away and it turns out we're back to normal. I just don't see it as likely.
Jeffrey, hagamos un corte y seguimos con más preguntas después.
En Coto nos importa hacer crecer a nuestro país. Por eso exportamos al mundo producción agrícola, ganadera, porcina y avícola propia, productos de nuestros frigoríficos de máxima calidad, como también desarrollos inmobiliarios y proyectos tecnológicos. Coto, una empresa que exporta, un país que crece.
Vuelve Pampita, porque querías volver a verla. Un regreso lleno de sorpresas. La actualidad, las últimas tendencias y los mejores invitados están en Pampita Online. Desde este lunes a las 18 horas por Net TV.
¿Tu pelo puede superar el daño? DAV prueba que sí. Expusimos los pinceles a daños extremos y luego tratamos un pincel con DAV. La diferencia es clara. DAV es insuperable en la regeneración del daño. No importa lo que el pelo tenga que enfrentar, sol, transpiración, lo que sea, está listo para todo. Sedal Ceramidas, con microceramidas y activos reparadores UV, deja el pelo fuerte y brillante siempre. Sedal Ceramidas.
Hoy queremos cuidarte a vos, que tanto cuidaste de los tuyos. A vos, que les decías a tus hijos que se quedaran en casa cuando afuera estaba feo. Hoy te queremos pedir lo mismo. Vos quédate en casa, nosotros vamos. Por eso habilitamos Tu Día, nuestra línea telefónica exclusiva para mayores de 60 años de Cava y GBA, donde llamás, comprás y recibís todo dentro de las 72 horas. Anotá 2040 1010. En Día, creemos que un poquito de cada uno hace la diferencia.
En la calle. Planes desde 1.209 pesos final por mes. Vení a Telecentro. Te conviene más.
¿Tu pelo puede superar el daño? DAB prueba que sí. Expusimos los pinceles a daños extremos y luego tratamos un pincel con DAB. La diferencia es clara. DAB es insuperable en la regeneración del daño.
Hola, te quiero contar que Cicatricure tiene una nueva línea antiarrugas. Cicatricure Age Care. 3 cremas de uso diario para distintas necesidades. Antiarrugas humectante con ácido hialurónico. Antiarrugas reafirmante con colágeno. Antiarrugas aclarante con niacinamida. De textura liviana, hidratantes y con filtro UV. Ahora cuidarte cuesta poco.
Nueva línea Cicatricure Age Care.
En ALA convocamos a distintas personas para que nos cuenten su experiencia con el lavado de la ropa.
Lavar la ropa lo tengo que hacer.
Poco tiempo, eso es lo primero que tenemos.
Y yo voy, tiro y lavo.
Que saque las manchas, que deje blanco, que deje mucho olo.
Y los invitamos a que prueben el nuevo ALA líquido y comprueben sus resultados.
Sacó todas las manchas enseguida y dejó un olor riquísimo. Cuando lo saqué no quería colgar la ropa, la quería dejar ahí para que me perfumara todo.
Y la verdad anduvo perfecto. Es fácil de usar y la ropa me sale limpia.
Nuevo ALA líquido lavado perfecto. Comprobalo vos también.
Cuando se trata de comida, el plato fuerte es compartir ese momento con otro. Una videollamada, manos libres. No es la primera vez que nos arreglamos con lo que tenemos. Aunque hoy nos encontremos en casas diferentes, podemos seguir compartiendo eso que tanto nos gusta. La mesa. NOR. Unamos la mesa.
Para desafiar a la gravedad en tu piel, Cicatricure Go Lift. Crema de día, de noche y un nuevo contorno dúo para tratar arrugas perioculares y código de barra, que generan un efecto de tristeza y mayor edad. En 6 semanas se reducen las arrugas gravitacionales, renovando tu expresión.
Cicatricure Gold Lift.
¿Tu pelo puede superar el daño? DAB prueba que sí. Expusimos los pinceles a daños extremos y luego tratamos un pincel con DAB. La diferencia es clara. DAB es insuperable en la regeneración del daño.
La tele no se mira, se vive con 4K Ultra HD. Planes desde 1.209 pesos final por mes. Vení a Telecentro, te conviene más.
Agarra tus zapatillas, agarra tu colchoneta, agarra ritmo, agarra impulso, agarra lo que quieras. Agarra confianza. Tus manos están protegidas. Lavándolas nos cuidamos entre todos. Rexona antibacterial. Elimina el 99% de las bacterias. Ahora también Rexona antibacterial alcohol en gel, spray y aerosol. Manos protegidas en todo momento.
Encontrá la propiedad que buscas en argenprop.com. Entrá.
No importa lo que el pelo tenga que enfrentar, sol, transpiración, lo que sea, está listo para todo. Sedal Ceramidas, con microceramidas y activos reparadores UV, deja el pelo fuerte y brillante siempre. Sedal Ceramidas.
Me duele tanto la cabeza, te juro que me la cortaría. Ah, tengo la solución para vos.
Nueva Sierra Masterpaint. Chao cabeza, chao dolor.
Sandra, tómate un Tafirol Migra.
La fórmula de Tafirol Migra tiene triple acción. Alivia el dolor, amplía su acción analgésica y potencia su efecto. No te cortes la cabeza.
Tafirol Migra. Alivia más de un dolor de cabeza.
Amazon Prime.
Telecentro te trae Amazon Prime Video. Ahora podés disfrutar de más series y más películas. Vení a Telecentro, te conviene más.
Alivia la tos de toda tu familia con el nuevo Tucol familiar. Expulsa la tos y la flema de manera efectiva. Disminuye la viscosidad del moco, formando un film que recubre suavemente la garganta irritada. Gracias a su nueva fórmula enriquecida con miel y tomillo, volvé a sentir el placer de respirar. Nuevo Tucol familiar, el expulsador de tos y flema.
Un libro que escribiste junto con Stiglitz se llamaba Escapar de la maldición de los recursos naturales. ¿Esa maldición es en la Argentina responsable de su falta de desarrollo?
Argentina has such a complicated history that it's hard to identify exactly one problem, except for the fact that crises became the problem. Just the history of crisis itself has made Argentina crisis prone because of their self-fulfilling nature. Why Argentina fell into that crisis is, of course, the matter of long debate of economic historians. I spent time studying that question. Of course, it does go back to the 1930s, the Roker-Runciman treaties. It goes back to the protectionism of the British Empire. It goes to all of the instabilities of the 1940s and 1950s. You could date it, of course, to preceding Argentine history, social inequalities, instability, and to subsequent history, the recent history of many financial crises. But I think that the way out is another matter. And the way out, I would say, does depend on Argentina and Latin America in general moving to a much more diversified and technology-based economy and society, rather than the base of the rich pampas and the vast natural resources that have been the lifeblood of South America's economy for 500 years. And so in this sense, the idea of the resource curse does resonate. It doesn't explain everything about Argentina's history, but it does point to a current fundamental fact. And it's something that I've felt very powerfully throughout my career and experience. When I go to Asia, all the talk is about technology. When I come to Latin America, the talk is about culture, politics, society, but rarely about technology. And so there's really a difference of organization and perception. Latin America is the region of lawyers, novelists, dramatists, and psychiatrists, and Asia is the region of engineers. And I think it would not hurt to have some more engineering in Argentina. I mean, heaven knows Argentina has produced some of the world's great scientists, often doing their science in other places, sometimes in Argentina, but not really the roster of leading engineers in history. And yet economic development is so much based on engineering. And I think that this is a missing part of Latin America's strategy that goes back to its resource endowments and the vast wealth of the country. It's actually interestingly true in the United States also, because we're also a petrostate. We're also an oil politics. Trump is a reflection of the oil and gas industry. It's enough to drive you crazy, but it is a reflection of this vast natural resource base as a, sometimes lazy excuse for what should be harder work when it comes, for example, to moving out of dangerous fossil fuels into renewable energy.
Uno de tus libros emblemáticos lleva como título El fin de la pobreza. Y vos fuiste asesor especial de las Naciones Unidas para el desarrollo sustentable. Jeffrey, hay países que eran pobres y lograron salir de la pobreza. Hay otros países que eran pobres y no pudieron salir de ella y continúan en la situación de pobreza. Pero hay muy pocos casos de países que eran ricos y se volvieron pobres como Argentina. Como especialista en desarrollo, ¿cuál es el problema del subdesarrollo de la Argentina?
Actually, Argentina is not a poor country. It's got some poor people, to be sure, but it is not a poor country despite all of the crises of the 20th century, all of the disasters. Argentina is not a poor country, and partly it has such a astounding, rich natural inheritance that it's almost impossible to be a poor country. It's interesting, by the way, a rich country that now really is a poor country in South America is Venezuela. But that's partly because of very bad policies of Chavez and Maduro, and it's partly because of the absolute cruelty of the United States in trying to overthrow Maduro by crushing the Venezuelan economy. So that's a different matter. That's a case of deliberate impoverishment at the hands of US sanctions. Fortunately, Argentina is not in that category. I think, if you go back to what we were just discussing on the resource curse, Argentina, of course, became wealthy in the early 20th century on the basis largely of agricultural exports, which were so productive, both the grains and meat products, that it made Argentina one of the rich countries of the world in per capita terms. The Great Depression was the end of that model of development, but not the end of Argentina's focus on agriculture as the core of its export industry. And so famously, Argentina became inward protectionist, partly in response to the new protectionism that Britain entered in the 1930s in very adverse forced treaties with Argentina, and the protectionism in the world in the 1940s and 1950s. But even during periods of opening international trade, once again, I would say Argentina is a rich, prosperous, and very literate population, strangely didn't become global leader in new technologies. A good comparison of Argentina throughout history has been Australia, also a commodity-based economy, very rich in commodities, suffering booms and busts, though not hyperinflations like Argentina. But Australia moved to a much more diversified economy after the 1970s. And maybe it's really the last 50 years that one could ask, what are the new sectors in Argentina? Where was the investment in new technologies? Not that Argentina is completely laggard in this regard, but it's neither a leader either. And if you think about the many sectors of advanced machinery or digital technologies where Australia has an important foothold in the world economy, or you think even more of Korea, which is, from a natural resource point of view, impoverished and facing a hostile border, and yet it became one of the 2 or 3 or 4 iconic world leaders in the digital age. That's really a very big difference, and that's where I would put my finger on the difference of economic history, and where I would like to see Argentina think carefully and society-wide, and not across the typical, or not in a typical political conflictual way about what Argentina can and should look like in 30 years. Because that would, I think, reorient in a useful way Argentina's investments in its people, in technology, in choice of industry, and so forth. And even to this moment, Argentina is putting its new hopes in new natural resources, in new natural gas deposits, for example. I regard this as ridiculous because the whole world's trying to get out of carbon. Hasn't Argentina heard? Don't go deeper into carbon. We've got more oil and gas than the world could ever safely use. How could Argentina base its future on that? Where you have so much wind power, solar power, hydropower, but yet Argentina wants to double down on new natural gas deposits, on fracking, on other things in the midst of this oil glut in the world. So I think that thinking ahead technologically is always a good idea, but it's especially a good idea right now because we're moving to a worldwide digital, renewable economy. And that's where the exports are going to be. That's where the income earnings are going to be. That's where the new leading edge sectors are going to be. And Argentina, of course, can play an important role in that, but it takes a decade of investments that are directed in that way.
Cuando Argentina hizo su default a fin del 2001, vos escribiste un libro que se titulaba Resolver la crisis de la deuda de los países de bajos ingresos. ¿Imaginabas en ese momento que Argentina iba nuevamente a caer en una crisis de deuda 18 años después? ¿Y qué cambió en estas 2 décadas con las crisis de las deudas de los países de bajos ingresos?
I probably would have predicted it just on a 20-year cycle. So, as I've said, I don't find anything extraordinary about it. I hope it doesn't happen 20 years from now. That's really the main point. You know, I got involved in debt crises starting in 1982 with the Mexican debt crisis. I had just gotten my PhD. I was an assistant professor in international finance, and Mexico went into default, and then everybody went into default. And I spent several years working on that, helping to negotiate debt relief, helping to prod the U.S. into accepting the need for debt restructurings, negotiating the first such debt restructuring for Bolivia in 1986, working with President Menem, working with many Latin American leaders then in Eastern Europe. So I've seen this for a long time. All through this period, there has been a basic institutional failing, which is we don't have decent mechanisms for restructuring debts. In domestic economy, we have bankruptcy proceedings. Those restructure debts. In the case of governments in the United States, we have Chapter 9 proceedings. The government gets into trouble, it gets its debt restructured so that it can get out of trouble. We don't have that in the international context and haven't during the last 40 years. You'll recall, of course, that in the late 1990s, partly based on my work and prodding, there was the idea of a debt restructuring mechanism that the IMF actually put forward. it was shot down by Wall Street. Wall Street is pretty rapacious and very arrogant, and knows that the U.S. government serves Wall Street. And so they knew in the end better to go for bailouts, go for U.S. power rather than for a system that would provide rules for this kind of restructuring. I'm afraid that things have gotten worse rather than better since this international debt restructuring mechanism was shot down. And again, that wasn't an academic idea at that point. That was coming from the IMF leadership. But Wall Street and Wall Street's agent, the US Treasury Secretary, killed it. Since then, things have gotten worse in general because vulture funds developed. Hedge funds are absolutely anti-system players. In other words, they make their money precisely on being holdouts to collective action. And they became powerful. And then very disastrously, the US courts, especially the federal courts in New York, came to champion these holdouts as the standard for decision making. Whereas when I was growing up and studying these issues the first time, the courts gave a lot of deference to governments with sovereign immunity, or international comity of nations, not comity, comity, meaning you respect the other nation. The courts started respecting Wall Street hedge funds more than nations, more than International Monetary Fund processes and so forth. Again, this is part of the overall neoliberalism that somehow the markets should dominate politics, even when we know that there are big market failures in financial workouts. That's why we have bankruptcy law within any country. So all of it is to say things have gotten worse institutionally since 2002. And that's why it all takes time. It's not impossible to get an agreement. It's just not easy to get one. Since Argentina does not have to rush back and should not rush back to the capital markets, just remaining patient and calm, to my point of view, is the right strategy. It would be horrendous, shocking, and I don't think would happen to go after Argentina or any other country in the midst of this pandemic. And the U.S. has enough on its own hands facing its own Great Depression and its own ongoing pandemic to even think in those terms.
Jeffrey, en la Argentina lo que se discute es que es correcto que probablemente el Estado no pueda volver al mercado de deuda voluntaria por muchos años. Pero el problema es la deuda de las empresas privadas, porque si el default del Estado se mantiene, muchas empresas privadas no van a poder renovar su deuda y el costo económico para la economía argentina no va a ser ya de la deuda del Estado, sino del quiebre de un montón de empresas o la falta de desarrollo de un montón de empresas. ¿Qué pensás vos sobre eso?
I think that the markets are quite likely to see past the sovereign ceiling in this case. That I don't really envision Argentina as a integral entity being written down or written off from capital markets for viable companies doing viable business, especially in this era of very low interest rates and ample liquidity. I doubt that is going to transpire. What I would say in general is the future is very unclear right now because of global uncertainty, global lack of leadership, instability in the United States, worldwide economic uncertainties. And so anything I'm saying has to be, in any event, constantly reevaluated over time. I don't think anyone really has a crystal ball on these issues. I believe that the prudent course right now is to wait for a sound agreement because of Argentina's history precisely, that making some kind of quick fix just leads to a new crisis. And since I've been watching Argentina fall in and out of crises for 40 years, I guess I also am hoping that this won't simply be a quick fix to another crisis in a year or 2 or 3. So just to be clear, that's another reason why I'm recommending myself be patient for something that can really work and can really hold significantly. I have to say that if it turns out that it just becomes brutally painful to do this, which I do not believe is the case right now, or that the U.S. or the U.S. courts or others find ways to extract extraordinary pain, or that the spillovers to the private economy really become costly and unbearable, you'd have to reconsider. This is a matter of prudence. It's not a matter of a clear playbook. But what I'm saying is weigh all of those claims or worries, which are understandable, against a different prudential reality, which is that Argentina needs a solution that's reasonable, so that it doesn't just bounce to the next crisis and the next crisis and the next crisis. And so whatever is reached in solution, it should be based on evidence, good faith, and a determination to really solve this problem, not just to postpone it once again for a year or two. And it's important to understand, and how odd it is, in fact, how strongly the IMF is supporting Argentina's position in this. And the reason is that the IMF staff is just technocrats, good ones, by the way. They make spreadsheets. They look at numbers for a living. Their fate is actually not bound up with Argentina per se. It's bound up with the accuracy of their spreadsheets. And when they look at the numbers, they reach the same conclusion that Minister Guzman reaches, same conclusion I reach, the same conclusion that Joe Stiglitz reaches, which is, come on, this is not a situation that is the right situation. It needs a restructuring among grown-up responsible actors so that we can move forward without even deeper mishaps in a world which tragically is facing too many mishaps right now. So that's the prudential standard that I'm arguing for. Not a guarantee, not lock the door and throw away the key, not storm away or have a grand campaign, not call for the upheaval of the international system as unfair and unjust. Just try to find a prudential outcome that can really work and that can really last.
Jeffrey, a comienzos de siglo vos escribiste un libro titulado La significancia estratégica de la desigualdad global. Y la crisis del coronavirus aumentó aún más la desigualdad, incrementando la riqueza de los más ricos, especialmente las empresas digitales, y la pobreza de los más pobres. ¿Siempre ganan los ricos, sea en crecimiento o en recesión?
Well, I think there are two different things to think about. One is we all lose in this epidemic, although the poor lose more than the rich. The key is to end the epidemic itself, to suppress the virus. And for that, I would point out that countries in the Asia Pacific, China, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, have all ended the epidemic. Not to zero, but nearly to zero. This is what Argentina should do. This is what South America should do. This is what my own country should do. Use public health intensively to stop the epidemic. The poor will be the biggest beneficiaries of that, but the rich will also be big beneficiaries of that. Then there are longer term trends aside from this horrendous epidemic. And the longer term trends are towards greater inequality. And they have two parts to them. One part is the underlying technological change. The digital age, by and large, has unemployed the unskilled and given income and benefits to the skilled and to the capital owners. So the basic trend of technological advancement has been a bigger pie in which the rich get most of the big increase. So it's both enlarging our productivity, but shifting the distribution of the national income towards the rich. That by itself would mean that while the technological revolution is a good thing, it requires redistribution of income. The second fact, though, is that the rich, especially in the United States, but it's pretty much true around the world, have gained the levers of power by and large. The United States is a plutocracy or an oligarchy. It is run by very, very rich people, or at least on behalf of very rich people. They pay for the billions of dollars spent in campaigns to elect candidates. Rich people win office, and rich people pay for those who go to office. And then what do the politicians do? They vote tax cuts for the rich. That further exacerbates the inequality. So for both of these reasons, we're ending up in a world of greater and greater inequality. I believe that technological advancement is a benefit for humanity. I really like the digital revolution. I think it can lead to better access to public services, to health, to education, to finance, to payment systems, to political participation, e-voting, to better drafting of legislation, to more transparency. I'm not naive to all the problems of fake news and cyber warfare and spying and all the rest, to be sure. But I think on the whole, this technology can work for human betterment. But it doesn't mean that Mr. Jeffrey Bezos, the owner of Amazon, needs $150 billion of wealth after all. During this pandemic, his wealth has gone up about $50 billion. Come on! This is absolutely extraordinary.
En la Argentina tenemos un caso similar con el propietario de la empresa Mercado Libre, que aumentó en $18.000 millones su valor en los 3 meses durante el coronavirus.
This is natural. We've moved so much faster to a digital economy than we could have ever imagined. And the result is that we have the first digital pandemic in history. The economies are continuing to operate even with the offices shut, because so much work can be done from home. So many services can be provided through e-commerce or online. It's rather remarkable what we've discovered. You'd think if nobody could go to work, the economy would collapse 80%, but instead it collapses maybe 20% because so much is being done online from home. But it doesn't mean that we all have to work for Bezos. This is a matter. And then you look at what's happening. The Europeans are saying we ought to tax the digital enterprises. And the U.S. government, not Amazon, the U.S. government says we will retaliate if you tax the digital enterprises. Now, why is that? The U.S. government should be saying we're going to tax the digital enterprises too, so we have to find a fair way to do it. But remember, the United States is a plutocracy. It serves the corporate sector. it doesn't regulate or tax the corporate sector, it serves the corporate sector. And so Trump sees Amazon's interest as the same as the US government's interest. And he threatens retaliation against Europe for daring to tax Amazon. It's extraordinary. Of course, we're not going to have a fair society if a few powerful companies run the governments and determine our tax policies on that basis.
Hoy en Argentina se discute un impuesto especial para las 12.000 personas más ricas como una contribución especial para paliar la crisis del coronavirus. ¿Qué te parecen los impuestos a la riqueza y los puntuales impuestos, por ejemplo, para el coronavirus?
It's a good idea. People with wealth should pay more. This is true in the United States. It's true in Europe. It's true in New York City. The wealth is extraordinary. About 15 Americans have $1 trillion of net worth. 1 trillion, my God. And that has soared in recent years. And most of it, or all of it in some cases, is sheltered. They hardly pay a cent on it. This is just no way to organize a decent society. And when the COVID epidemic hits, we don't have social solidarity. We don't have a government that can function, because in a plutocracy, nothing functions properly.
Vos, Jeffrey, fuiste autor de los 17 Objetivos del Desarrollo Sostenible en el trabajo de las Naciones Unidas a principios de siglo, y también escribiste un libro titulado La Era del Desarrollo Sostenible, fue uno de tus últimos libros en el 2014. ¿Siguen valiendo las mismas premisas de antes del coronavirus, después del coronavirus? ¿Y qué va a cambiar, a tu juicio, el mundo para mejor o para peor el coronavirus?
The notion of sustainable development, that we should be organizing our economic and social lives for productivity and prosperity on the one hand, but for social justice and environmental sustainability. So a triple bottom line of economy, society, and environment is even more urgent and true today than it was in the past. The COVID epidemic itself, after all, is what we call a zoonotic disease. It's a disease that was transferred from an animal reservoir or animal population, presumably bats in southwest China, to humans. And this kind of disease spread from humans coming into contact with nature in new ways is leading to many new emerging diseases, not just COVID-19. We've had SARS, we've had MERS, we've had recombinant influenzas. And so we're not taking care of the way we interact with nature at all. But beyond that, beyond the diseases, we have mega pollution, we have land use destruction, we have the Amazon on fire, we have climate change with more than 30 degrees Celsius in Siberia right now. Unbelievable record temperatures in Siberia that are absolutely unbelievable and dangerous. And so the idea of sustainable development is the only prudent way for humanity to achieve well-being that can last, rather than destroying the foundations of our society and even our survival, is more evident than ever. You know, for years and years, the public health specialists told us there's going to be a pandemic, there's going to be a pandemic. The politicians don't listen. They're not trained. They are short-term thinkers, if they're thinkers at all. We have a president who thinks at the length of a tweet and horizon of the next tweet. And so it's complete improvisation, whereas what sustainable development is saying is think ahead, think where we're going. It would say to Argentina, maybe natural gas is just not the best way to go for the future. Maybe there really is a different kind of economy that should be built, not the get rich quick fix of yet another commodity that booms and busts. And so this is really the message of sustainable development. And everything we ignored about the risk of pandemics, we're ignoring today about the risks of climate change, which are absolutely horrendously dangerous. But the same politicians, take Trump, he can't listen about COVID. He absolutely can't listen about climate change. It's the same faulty mentality. Think about Bolsonaro, same thing. It's not an accident that these terrible presidents who can't fight a pandemic also can't think about the future of humanity. It's the same impulse that's leading to this. And so in this sense, sustainable development is, to come back to a word I've used repeatedly, is a matter of prudence. It's a matter of taking due care for our well-being for the future.
Jeffrey, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Great to be with you.